Tantor Audio presents The Myth of the Spoiled Child, challenging the conventional wisdom about children and parenting, by Alfie Kohn. Narrated by Alfie Kohn.
Chapter 1. Permissive Parents, Coddled Kids, and Other Reliable Boogeymen. This time it's different. Again. It's the sort of rhetorical cliché favored by high school orators and academics who are trying to spice up their plotting monographs. Offer an anonymous quotation that's directly pertinent to the topic, and then reveal with a flourish that the source is actually decades or even centuries old. Ha! Gotcha! This device, however, has the potential to be more than a source of mild entertainment. To read strikingly familiar observations or sentiments offered by people long dead is to be deprived of the myth of uniqueness, and that can be usefully unsettling. Whenever we're apt to sound off about how certain aspects of modern life are unprecedented in their capacity to give offense, the knowledge that our grandparents or distant ancestors said much the same thing, give or take a superficial detail, ought to make us stop talking in mid-sentence and sit down, hard. Take education. Commentators and veteran teachers often announce, in a tone of either resignation or disgust, that the performance of our students and the standards to which they're held have become increasingly lax. Kids do the bare minimum and manage to get away with it. Heck, they're actually pleased with themselves and celebrated by others for their mediocrity. In recent years, one article observed, parents have cried in dismay that their children could not read out loud, could not spell, could not write clearly, while employers have said that mechanics could not read simple directions. Many a college has blamed high schools for passing on students who could not read adequately to study college subjects. High schools have had to give remedial reading instruction to students who did not learn to read properly in elementary schools, unquote. On and on goes this devastating indictment of our education system. Or, well, perhaps not our education system, since few of us had much to say about school policy when this article appeared in 1954. Comparable Jeremiads were published, of course, in the 1970s and 80s, an influential example being the Reagan administration's deeply dishonest Nation at Risk report. But couldn't one argue that those, like today's denunciations of falling standards, reflect the same legacy of multiculturalism, leftist education professors, and the post-Woodstock cultural realignment that brought down traditional values inside and outside of schools? Yes, indeed, one could certainly make that argument. But defending it proves rather difficult, given that people were attacking America's supposedly dysfunctional education system before Vietnam, before civil rights, before feminism, and were striking the very same tone of aggressive nostalgia. So if pundits were throwing up their hands even during the Eisenhower era about schools on the decline and students who could barely read and write, the obvious question is this: when exactly was that golden period distinguished by high standards? The answer, of course, is that it never existed. Quote, "The story of declining school quality across the 20th century is, for the most part, a fable," says social scientist Richard Rothstein, whose book The Way We Were cites a series of similar attacks on American education moving backward one decade at a time. Each generation invokes the good old days, during which we discover people had been doing exactly the same thing. Thus, middle-aged grumblers during the 1950s undoubtedly grew misty-eyed as they recalled their days in school. You know, back when excellence mattered and excuses weren't accepted. How inconvenient, then, to discover that when they were children, adults had been outraged that the judges of a college essay contest were forced to select, quote, "the essay having the fewest errors," in 1911. And high school students missed 2 out of every 3 questions on a test of, quote, the simplest and most obvious facts of American history in 1917. Did someone say grade inflation? Everyone knows that A's are handed out like fun-size candy bars on Halloween nowadays, a disgraceful dilution of rigorous standards that, quote, got started in the late 60s and early 70s. As Harvard University's Harvey Mansfield tells the widely accepted story. Blame all the bleeding heart radical professors hired and tenured during that period. Hence a report from Harvard's own Committee on Raising the Standard. Quote, grades A and B are sometimes given too readily. Grade A for work of not very high merit, and grade B for work not far above mediocrity. One of the chief obstacles to raising the standards of the degree is the readiness with which insincere students gain passable grades by sham work, unquote. Except that report was written in, you saw this coming, didn't you, 1894. Back then, letter grades were still a novelty at the university, less than 1 decade old, but Mansfield's ideological forebears were already complaining about how little the top grades had come to mean. Nostalgia is only amnesia turned around, said the poet Adrian Rich. Of course, all this historical evidence doesn't mean that today's scolds, braying about our recent decline, will finally sit down and shut up. It just means they should. Before the days of dumbing down and propping up, we held high standards for children at home as well as in school. That declaration appears in a book published in 2003 called The Epidemic: The Rot of American Culture, Absentee and Permissive Parenting, and the Resultant Plague of Joyless, Selfish Children. Once you've read the subtitle, you've read the book. Like many other writings from the grouchy, wistful school of cultural criticism, it contends that education is just the beginning of our current problems. Indeed, the last few years have brought a boatload of polemics that focus less on how children are taught than on how they're raised. Given that the latter is our primary focus in this book, we might be forgiven for wondering what to make of claims that kids today are more spoiled than ever before, and that parental authority has eroded over time. Is it possible that a response of "been there, seen that" is called for here too? Even without a trip to the archives, readers of a certain age will recall that condemnations of pervasive permissiveness are hardly new. For starters, the very same points being made today about pushover parents and their coddled offspring could be found in books published in the early 1990s. Spoiled Rotten, Today's Children and How to Change Them. And in the early 1980s, Parent Power. The latter was written by the Christian conservative John Rosemond, but at least 3 other books over the last few decades have used that same title with its call for an unapologetic assertion of control. A little earlier, in 1976, U.S. News & World Report ran an article called Permissiveness, a Beautiful Idea That Didn't Work. And a couple named Joseph and Lois Bird wrote in their 1972 manifesto Power to the Parents that, quote, teaching the child responsibility is not a popular idea these days. Most parents and teachers expect too little from kids, they explained, with the result that we now have to worry not only about the terrible teens, but also about the rebellious preteens and the obstreperous grammar schoolers. The Birds hearkened back to a simpler time, though with no hint of when that was, during which, quote, we knew what we believed in, before those pseudo-psychologists started telling us that children need more freedom. Not too long ago, Time magazine's cover featured an illustration of a smirking boy, his arms folded and a gold crown on his head, surrounded by an enormous collection of toys. "Do kids have too much power?" the cover demanded in bold-face capitals. Guess what the answer was? The article reported that 80% of people think kids today are more spoiled than kids of 10 or 15 years ago. But there's every reason to believe that a poll taken 10 or 15 years earlier would have found a large majority making precisely the same claim. When the author of a book called Spoiling Childhood warns, "We have entered an era of permissiveness in which the scales are tipped toward gratification," that can be true only if the word era denotes a period of at least 40 years. Clearly, there's not much difference between what we're hearing today about how children are raised and what was being said before most parents of younger children were even born. Here, though, just as with claims about education, the possibility exists that we're merely suffering from a lengthy interval of crumbling values and lax parenting, one that can be traced back to all those tie-dyed baby boomers who were allowed to do as they pleased and are now raising their own children the same way. Does it all get back to the tectonic shift of the late 1960s and early 70s? Did people raise their children responsibly before everything went to pot? Like, say, in the early 1960s? Apparently not. Journalist Peter Wyden declared in Suburbia's Coddled Kids that it's become, quote, tougher and tougher to say no and make it stick. The cover of his book, published in 1962, depicted a child lounging on a divan, eating grapes, while Mom fans him and Dad holds an umbrella to protect him from the sun. Perhaps the artist was the parent or even the grandparent of whoever created that Time cover, illustrating how kids have never had so much power as they do now. Newsweek, meanwhile, which warned us a few years ago about the need to just say no to today's youngsters who want it all, managed to scoop itself in the early 1960s with a cover that depicted a little girl with a miniature mother and father standing on her outstretched hands. It asked the ominous question, "Are we trapped in a child-centered world?" The answer was conveniently supplied by The Child Worshippers, a 1963 book by Martha Weinman Lear. "We are living, like it or not, in a child-centered society. In fact, child worship is in some ways a national epidemic." Any chance that things were better in the mid-1950s, despite the failing schools? Let's check in with Marguerite and Willard Beecher, authors of Parents on the Run. Quote, "Time was when parents had their own authority about the rearing of children. In those days, children were supposed to be seen and not heard. The fear of parents and of God was instilled in them. There was no backtalk and no nonsense. The homes of yesteryear were adult-centered. Today, in 1955, we have the child-centered home. In it there is little peace and quiet, and certainly not much respect for or fear of authority. Today's comic tragic home reveals the child is firmly and autocratically in command. Parents are barely tolerated around the house. Indeed, it is parents who are to be seen and not heard." Unquote. That denunciation was echoed by respondents to another poll, who lambasted contemporary 1950s moms and dads for being not strict enough, as well as by Parents magazine in a January 1950 article, When and How to Say No, that condemned parents for being, quote, unable to take the responsibility for being grown up and making decisions. Okay, so the problem didn't start with the peace and love generation. Here's a fallback hypothesis. Perhaps it began with Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose name in conservative circles has long been synonymous with permissiveness. If kids are insufficiently deferential, one author informs us, it's because of, quote, the influence of progressive child-rearing experts and educators. This movement started with Dr. Spock, unquote. Alas, this explanation too suffers from a couple of rather serious flaws, beginning with the fact that Dr. Spock never really deserved his reputation. His famous Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, hardly reads as a manual for letting children do as they please. Spock's reputation for permissiveness was due mostly to his suggestion that parents should not impose a rigid feeding schedule on an infant or potty training demands on an unready toddler. In his approach to discipline and related topics, he was actually quite moderate. The famous distillation of his advice to mothers was, trust yourself, not trust your kids. Quote, don't say to young children, do you want to? Just do what's necessary, he advised. It's easy to fall into the habit of saying to a small child, do you want to have your lunch? It is better not to give him a choice. Unquote. Moreover, the book went through 7 more editions during his lifetime, with its title shortened to Baby and Child Care, and he seemed to grow increasingly conservative as the years went by. Beginning with the 2nd edition in 1957, Spock took pains to emphasize his conservative credentials on the very first page. Quote, nowadays there seems to be more chance of a conscientious parent's getting into trouble with permissiveness than with strictness. Unquote. Like so many others, Spock regarded that as a serious problem, and one that he himself clearly didn't create. By the 3rd edition, he was even more worried about the possibility that children might be spoiled, and he recommended that parents just let them cry if they resisted going to sleep, lest they become dependent on parental comfort. When he wasn't updating his book, Spock spent time rebutting the charge that he sanctioned permissiveness, beginning with the 1948 speech in which he denied being, quote, foolish enough to say that a child does not need control, as some people imagine we have said, unquote, and continuing in a magazine article almost a quarter-century later that was titled, Don't Blame Me. The other problem with the it's Spock's fault argument is that traditionalists were decrying what they saw as permissive parenting before this particular pediatrician ever set pen to paper. Shortly before his book was first published, an article in American Home, I've Raised 3 Selfish Little Savages, blamed progressive child-rearing for making the author's children believe, quote, they have priority over everything and everybody. Even earlier, during the 1920s, there had been a great hue and cry about the loss of parental authority in the modern home. Readers of the Atlantic Monthly, meanwhile, were treated to a stern rebuke directed to the younger generation. Sure, the author conceded, kids have always been pleasure seekers, but what we're currently witnessing, quote, is different from anything we have ever seen in the young before. Parents teach nothing wholeheartedly, and things now come so easily to children that they fail to develop any self-discipline. Forget about traditional values. Today it's just a culte du moi. That essay, by one Cornelia A.P. Kohn, was published in 1911 when Benjamin Spock was 8 years old. When Kohm's piece was subsequently reprinted in an anthology, the editor added his own 2 cents. He confessed that the older generation is bewildered. It cannot understand the freedom of youth. It agrees with foreign observers that American children have the worst manners in the world, that they are thoroughly spoiled, and that, intent upon pleasure and oblivious to duty, they are driving straight to destruction. He added, though the world has certainly changed before, it never has changed at the whirling speed of the last half-dozen years. That is, since 1915. This time, in other words, things really are different. That's what people today post on their blogs to get you to take their italicized complaints seriously, and it's what people were using fountain pens to communicate 100 years ago for the same reason. Appeals to historical perspective apparently need to be put in historical perspective. Set the Wayback Machine even earlier, and you'll find an English visitor clucking in 1832 about, quote, the total want of discipline and subjection which I observed universally among children of all ages in America. In fact, it's difficult to know when these themes weren't being sounded. One writer in the 1640s decried children who carry their insolence, quote, proudly, disdainfully, and scornfully toward parents. And there are reports of people having said these sorts of things thousands of years ago. The following rant, for example, is widely attributed to the Greek poet Hesiod, who lived in the 8th century BCE. Quote, I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today. For certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly disrespectful and impatient of restraint." Unquote. And this, allegedly from Socrates, quote, "Children today love luxury too much. They have detestable manners, flout authority, and have no respect for their elders. What kind of awful creatures will they be when they grow up?" True, even ample historical precedent doesn't rule out the possibility that parents are too permissive. Theoretically, they might always and everywhere have been so. But the force of the argument one hears, in books and articles, at seminars and dinner parties, is that parenting is more that way now than it used to be. Back then, parents set limits and kids obeyed, which is uncritically assumed to be desirable. Back then, standards were high and students were motivated and self-disciplined. Thus, if it turns out that back then people were actually saying the very same thing, we've taken the first step to forcibly deflate this hot air balloon. Are parents permissive? To call attention to the vintage of our whines, or, if you prefer, how long our gripes have been fermenting, is just one of many possible responses when we hear sweeping claims about how children nowadays are spoiled because parents fail to set limits. A reasonably thoughtful person might point out that there are actually three assertions being made here. Parents don't set limits, children act in a way we might describe as spoiled, and the first problem causes the second. Each of those claims needs to be proved. Anecdotes, even the sort that make us shake our heads and click our tongues, simply aren't sufficient. There has to be some reason to believe that the stories we hear, or the behaviors we happen to observe, are representative of the population at large. And that, in turn, means we need to define more precisely what we're talking about. Parents let their kids get away with murder, or kids are out of control, are not testable propositions, not just because they're vague, but because they're infused with the values of the speaker, who is really saying, parents put up with behaviors that I think they should forbid, or I disapprove of how some kids act. If we want to claim that more people act this way today than did those of prior generations, we need a clear way to circumscribe what we're looking for so we can compare data from different eras. So how should we evaluate a complaint such as, quote, "We live in a child-centered society where children's wants and demands are increasingly being given priority"? Our first response might be to ask how that assertion squares with deeply disturbing social indicators, such as the high number of American children in poverty, or the fact that juveniles are still tried and imprisoned as adults. More prosaically, we could point out that as a culture, our attitude toward children appears to be ambivalent at best. Parents love their own kids, but often have little patience with everyone else's. Sometimes we find children adorable, but more often we seem to regard them as nuisances. A good child is one who sits still and keeps quiet. Surveys of American adults consistently find what one newspaper report called a stunning level of antagonism, not just toward teenagers, but toward young children as well. Substantial majorities of our fellow citizens say they disapprove of kids of all ages, calling them rude, lazy, irresponsible, and lacking in basic values. In the 1930s, a researcher named Harold Anderson commented, "I think as a culture we have not yet learned to like children." One would have a tough time making a case that things have changed since then. In 2012, the late Elizabeth Young Broyle devoted an entire book to the, quote, "huge range of anti-child social policies and individual behaviors still in place." Child-centered? It's not clear that America today could be described even as child-friendly. On the other hand, there has been a shift over a long period of time toward regarding children as individuals who possess intrinsic worth, as human beings who should be treated humanely. Children in the industrialized world today are much less likely to be forced to work, or to be viewed chiefly as economic assets than they were as recently as the 1800s. Similarly, they are less likely to be seen as sinful creatures whose wills must be broken than was the case a few centuries ago. In the New England of Puritan times, children were publicly flogged. Play was viewed as unacceptably frivolous, even for toddlers. Babies were described as filthy, guilty, odious, abominable beings, and dealt with accordingly. Indeed, infanticide was common throughout human history, with children routinely abandoned, tortured, and sexually abused. Quote, "Prior to modern times, I have not been able to find evidence of a single parent who would not today be put in jail for child abuse or neglect," writes the historian Lord de Mouse. The answer to our question, then, depends on the time span we're considering and the definition we're using. Yes, there has been, quote, "greater expression of affection toward children and a greater interest in their development over the past several centuries in industrial Western societies," unquote. But that doesn't mean our culture is child-centered in the specific and pejorative way that phrase is often intended, with adults' needs and wishes made subservient to those of children. And what if the question is whether parents today are more permissive? Again, we need to proceed carefully. Does that word refer to treating kids more humanely, giving them something to say about what happens to them, allowing them to be heard as well as seen, acknowledging their preferences rather than bending them to our will? Does it mean we're willing to take our cue from young children about when they're hungry or tired, rather than making them eat or sleep when it's convenient for us? That we're willing to allow kids to fool around and have fun sometimes, and to comfort them when they're sobbing? In fact, these do seem to be just the sorts of attitudinal changes to which the word permissive referred when it was first used. And in those days, the general trend was indeed in that direction. One writer refers to, quote, "the ideology of permissive child-rearing that characterized advice to parents in the 1930s, a decade that produced a book with the revelatory title, Babies Are Human Beings." Another writer points out that what was described at the time as the new permissiveness reads today like common sense. People were starting to talk about children's needs and to realize that they progress through stages of development such that they may not be ready to assume a given responsibility or acquire a proficiency just because we demand that they do so. However, this progress didn't take place in simple linear fashion. The strictness that gave way to permissiveness was itself a reversal of an approach to child rearing during the 19th century that had been more responsive to children's needs. Things had gotten worse before they got better again. And that reversal was later reversed once more. The 1950s brought retrenchment, as even some of these basic principles were once again viewed with suspicion. Today, the word permissiveness has a different meaning. It doesn't signify humane treatment or a willingness to nurse infants when they're hungry. It means coddling kids in a way that's unhealthy by definition. Interestingly, the connotation of coddle also shifted. It once meant to treat tenderly. Now it means to overindulge. Permissive parenting these days is understood by the general public as well as by developmental psychologists to refer to an approach in which demands and limits are rarely imposed and children are pretty much free to do what they like. So, has any researcher tried to quantify the number of parents who could reasonably be classified as permissive in this sense? Most people who refer to an epidemic of permissive parenting just assume that this is true, that everyone knows it, and therefore that there's no need to substantiate the claim. My efforts to track down data by combing both scholarly and popular databases, as well as sending queries to leading experts in the field, have yielded absolutely nothing. I'm forced to conclude that no one has any idea how many parents could be considered permissive, how many are punitive, and how many are responsive to their children's needs without being permissive or punitive. The tendency to overlook that third possibility is a troubling and enduring trend in its own right. In short, there is absolutely no evidence to support the claim that permissiveness is the dominant style of parenting in our culture, or even that it's particularly common. Notice, though, that many authors, journalists, and casual commentators aren't just
Sample complete. Ready to continue?